Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Exploring the Textile Exchange Regenerative Agricultural Landscape Analysis Report. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also will be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion throughout the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Please note the antitrust statement. Textile Exchange convenes the textile community and values diversity of views, expertise, opinions, backgrounds, and experiences. It is expected that members of this community will collaborate by sharing ideas, information, and resources of publicly available information only and avoid discussions on price, strategic plans, or other private and sensitive information. With that said, now on to Beth with Textile Exchange. Beth?
Hello. Hello, everyone. Great to see everyone on this webinar. So Sarah and I are thrilled to welcome everyone. Sarah Kelly from Common Threads Consulting was our lead researcher and author on this report. And my name is Beth Jensen, and I'm Climate Plus Strategy Director at Textile Exchange. And so we're really happy to have you all here today and have the opportunity to go through a bit of an overview of this report that we recently came out with, which we hope will be a really foundational tool for the industry on this topic, which, as we all know, is a really hot one in the industry right now. So I joined Textile Exchange last June after some other roles in the apparel and textile space, and I was thrilled to know that this report was already in the works. So, and to come on board and to bring Sarah on board as well, and all of our wonderful sponsors to help guide and shape where this report ended up. So with that, I would also like to turn it over to each of the report sponsors for a few brief words on why they were interested to be involved in this project. So I'll start with Liz Hirschfeld with J. Crew Group.
Thanks, Beth. We're so excited to be a part of this, because of our strong relationship with Textile Exchange, and we really believe in the work that you all do. But also we had already started our journey on regenerative, and we're finding, we were learning a lot. So we knew we had some information to share and participate and really be like an active participant in this research, but also to learn, because if anyone started this journey, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of different ways to approach it, there's a lot of certifications, and it was just really, really wonderful to really support such important work that really kind of clarifies, what regenerative is, what all the different approaches are, and everything that's out there in terms of certifications and ways to approach it. So we are really just excited and thrilled to be a part of this and support it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. And Arif from Cotton Connect.
Thank you very much, Beth. Yes, Cotton is proud to be part of this, it's this endeavor. And I must say that one can find anything and everything in this report. This report is a call for action. And this is the biggest takeaway for all of us. It should be this call for action for companies to start investing in pilot projects that are developed in full financial partnership with farmer, indigenous communities, and researchers, generating more data on regenerative agriculture as they go, making this investment now will benefit soil, nature, and most of all the smallholders, which contribute, significantly in this sector. So I think this is a call for commitment for all of us.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Katrina from Caring.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm sorry I can't turn my camera on because I have a bad network, but we just wanted to say, at Caring, we've been working in Regen Ag for quite a few years now, and we really accelerated these efforts about a year ago. And one of the things that we found is that there's just no, comprehensive guide for our industry, the fashion industry, that really outlines how to go about this, how to begin the journey, how to deepen the journey if you're already on it. And so we thought, Textile Exchange is really the perfect partner to put something that is, a deep analysis and a how-to guide, if you will, and to put that out into the world for our industry. Because we really see, like all of you, an urgent need for our industry to transform. And we think that Regen Ag is probably one of the most compelling ways to go about this. So Congrats to the TE team for getting it done and for putting it out. I think it's a hugely valuable guide, and looking forward to the rest of the webinar.
Thanks so much, all three of you. And yeah, I would echo that. Just coming from a brand previous to this role, we were trying to do much of this, on our own. And so to have this sort of comprehensive guide for the industry is the hope of the value of this, and that it can serve as a jumping off point for future research and additional understanding that we need to dig into as an industry. So just to set the scene a bit, many of you have probably seen this graph before, but this is really showing our greenhouse gas emissions reduction modeling that we have done at Textile Exchange to really illustrate the pathway to getting to a 45% reduction, which is the target that we've set by 2030 in what we call the pre-spin phase of the textile value chain. And as you can see, there are three sort of levers that we need to pull to achieve this 45% reduction. The first one, I'll start in the middle, is material substitution. And that's really what I think Textile Exchange has historically been known for, really looking to preferred versions of what we would maybe consider conventional material. So, organic cotton, moving to recycled versions of materials, obviously certified materials, et cetera. And so what we need to do there is really aggressively substitute those materials. So we have known solutions, proven solutions today. Let's really accelerate those efforts as an industry, is kind of that first lever. The second lever is down here in the green, and that's really where we think regenerative ag fits, at least today, hoping to move it up into more of the sort of standard material substitution bucket in the very near future. But really looking at what are all of those interventions that we can, we can identify, but we can't necessarily specifically model for yet today within greenhouse gas modeling. So looking at things like, regenerative agriculture practices, and that's part of, the impetus for this report, is really trying to set the scene on this. Looking at, also, of course, innovative technologies, innovative materials, circular materials, et cetera. So really trying to fill the innovation gap there with solutions that we may not be able to account for today, but that we know are definitely the right direction to head in. And so how can Textile Exchange really help support our evolution of knowledge in this space? And then the last piece is really what we call slow growth, or in some circles, degrowth. And that's just really all about reducing growth that's specifically related to extraction of new materials to make new products. So knowing that we can't continue on these super aggressive, just really high growth rates that we've had as an industry in the past, how do we reduce those growth rates, but also think about other ways of creating value for businesses? It doesn't mean no value creation. It just means thinking differently about how we create value, and not having that always be linked to extraction of new materials and making brand new products. So these are the three levers. Just wanted to kind of illustrate where regenerative ag fits within our three key levers. Again, it's sort of today in the innovation gap, we would say, but moving up into the material substitution, hopefully, as soon as possible, with some of what we'll talk about today in terms of not only scale, but understanding how to account for this topic. And again, of course, we're not just looking at climate and GHG emissions reduction. We're also looking at many other interdependent impact areas. And this is sort of a core theme of this report as well. And this is really the Climate Plus strategy. So looking at climate and all of the climate work that we need to do urgently as an industry and as a sector, as the sort of North Star, how do we also make sure that we are building beneficial impacts in these other interdependent impact areas like biodiversity, water, and soil health. So that's really where the plus in the Climate Plus strategy comes from. The other reason for the plus is that this is really a pathway that's grounded in partnership. So we just want to, stress the fact that Textile Exchange will absolutely not be able to do this alone. We're part of a broad network of not only members, but partner organizations in this space. And we're all working together to try to achieve the change we urgently need. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah to start to go through some of the highlights from the report.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks everyone for joining us. So great to have everyone with us today. Sarah Kelly from Common Threads Consulting, and it has been a huge privilege to be able to work on this report with the incredible Textile Exchange team, with all of our sponsors and those who shared their perspectives with us in interviews, our expert reviewers, and so many others who really helped to shape and strengthen this report. So huge thanks to everyone for all the many people who helped this come together. I just want to start out with a quick recap of our goals for this project. This was really driven, as Beth said, by the sense that there was so much interest and work going on across the sector. So what we hope to do here was map the ecosystem of regenerative agriculture to provide a clearer understanding of the tools and programs that are available and potential partnerships for brands and companies. We hope to use that duplication of effort and provide a common framework, and also to offer concrete pathways for companies to deepen their engagement. So really making this actionable. And in doing that, provide some clarity on how regenerative agriculture can support existing climate, biodiversity, and social justice targets. So we call that making sense of the swirl, and we're hoping to leave you with this clear pathway here and going ahead. A couple important caveats there are that we did not have the expectation that we'd be able to capture every regenerative program in existence, really focused on some key categories. We did not aim to rank programs or recommend particular partners to any given company, just aiming for that neutral landscape scan approach. So yeah, if you can go to the next slide, Beth, thanks. What we hope to do in the way we approach this was through a combination of interview-driven research with 25 stakeholders across a range of categories, as well as a deep dive into the literature, both soil science literature and a range of industry reports from apparel, as well as the broader agriculture sector and the finance sector as well. And we put out a call for input in Textile Exchange's newsletter. Brought that into this outline that you can see here with some detailed background, and really frame this around a couple of key tools, which we're calling our engagement pathway and matrix of regenerative programs. So I'm going to walk us through our 5 key takeaways from the report, give you a little closer look at those central tools, and then Beth and I will share those recommendations for companies that came out. Again, I'm trying to make this as actionable as possible. So yeah, if you can go ahead, Beth, to our first key takeaway. So our number 1 takeaway here is that regenerative agriculture is really fundamental for the apparel and textile industry. This is grounded in the vision that Beth shared with you, and especially the goal of meeting 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. That is going to require fundamental transition to meet those climate changes that are already occurring, manage risk, and meet the need for adaptation and resilience. And importantly, a regenerative way of thinking also aligns with this imperative that Beth mentioned for really fundamentally new economic model for the sector, including more just, more transparent, and non-extractive supply chains, and this emerging emphasis on degrowth. Let's take a look in the next slide at what that looks like in the scientific literature. If you can go to the next slide, thanks, Beth. This image or visual comes from a 2019 journal article from Rowe and co-authors that looks at the potential of land sector solutions for climate. And you can see here the yellow part of the pathway is all the greenhouse gas cuts that are needed. The green part is the possible solutions from land-based solutions. And within that is this sort of pie chart where you can see that regenerative agriculture represents one part, the sort of blue-gray wedge. And just to flag, other strategies are very important as well, such as the green avoidance of deforestation. So the real take home here is that we need every wedge of this pie and every tool in the toolbox to meet these climate goals. Regenerative agriculture has immense promise for a range of co-benefits that we'll talk more about, but is not a singular climate solution. It really has to go hand in hand with all possible greenhouse gas cuts, as well as this range of other land-based solutions like deforestation. So if you can go to the next slide, Beth. These couple of images, I think, just give us a visual sense of that. On the right is a regenerative approach to rubber agroforestry in Indonesia. But you can see that if we have that going on at the same time as the type of deforestation shown on the left, we're really not seeing that net benefit that we want. So we need to be keeping both of these in mind, again, going hand in hand. And these pictures as well, that regenerative agriculture is relevant for all the major categories of textile fibers, including cropping, grazing, and agroforestry. So moving on to our second takeaway, we had a lot of interest in the definition of regenerative agriculture, a lot of discussion about this, and we heard really strongly from our interviews and our research that we can't reduce regenerative agriculture to a single definition or a single set of practices. It's place-based, it's context-based, and it really calls for putting local communities and local ecosystems at the core. That's very closely tied with our next in the next slide. That reminds us very strongly, again, from our interviews and our research about the indigenous roots of regenerative agriculture and the need to acknowledge those roots and that wisdom and the past and current racial injustices that have been part of this system, and to keep all that really front and center in the pathway going forward. So let's look in the next slide at how we worked on that question of what is regenerative agriculture in the report. This quote comes from a US farmer named Karen Washington, who also works on a financing vehicle called the Black Farmer Fund. And her words have really stuck with me since I had the chance to speak with her for an earlier report authored by my colleague Jenny O'Connor on barriers to regenerative agriculture in the US. These are indigenous practices, and we have to acknowledge and center that in all of our efforts. We, again, sort of tried to combine and compare that with what we're seeing in the scientific literature. And these four sort of pillars at the bottom come from a 2020 review by Newton and co-authors. They looked at 229 journal articles in the peer-reviewed literature, as websites from practitioner groups that use the term regenerative agriculture, broke that down into the specific components, and then looked at the frequency of use. So these are the top 4 outcomes that are mentioned in common between those two groups of peer-reviewed articles and websites. And they kind of give us sort of a minimal consensus of what's coming out of the literature right now. Noting that social justice component in addition to the ecological or biological elements that are maybe more commonly mentioned. And just a quick note here that while water was not in these top 4, it's so closely linked with biodiversity and soil health. It needs to stay part of the picture as it does in Textile Exchange's Climate Plus strategy. If you can go to the next slide, please. Textile Exchange has used that background to develop a working statement on regenerative agriculture. And you can find this in full detail in the report, just trying to lay out some of the core approaches and principles for the organization. Looking at our next takeaway, number 4, we really want to emphasize that regenerative agriculture is about much more than increasing soil carbon levels. We absolutely know that regenerative agriculture practices can build soil carbon, and that in turn has a range of co-benefits for water availability and quality, for biodiversity, both below ground and above ground, for disease resistance, climate resilience, and for community livelihoods and financial support for growers. I think in some ways it's easiest to see these through images. So if you can go to the next slide, Beth. These are just some photos of some of the practices that are most commonly included in regenerative systems. On the left, a no-till system with cover crops. On the right, an and I think you can just see here that in addition to building soil carbon, these practices create a much more diverse habitat for biodiversity to flourish, again, both below and above ground, prevent erosion, and offer multiple financial streams for growers. In the next slide, you can see that this is also the case for regenerative grazing systems, and with the additional important benefit of animal welfare. And this photo comes from Sheniko Wool Company, one of the case studies that we feature in the report. And on the next slide, please, just importantly, reminder again that COVID also include supporting community livelihoods and really respecting and centering Indigenous stewardship here in a cotton food agroecological project with Indigenous family farms in Bolivia. So this is again just emphasizing the range of co-benefits that we see from regenerative agriculture practices, which will vary by context, but have these common elements. It is important to note that there has been a sort of a shifting consensus in the soil science literature about the specific mechanism of sequestering carbon in soils over the long term. And that is requiring a little bit of reconsideration of the mathematical underpinning of the computer models that predict how much carbon could be stored in soil and for how long. So for that reason, we recommend that the industry proceed with due diligence around these specific questions on carbon sequestration over the long term, as well as carbon credits and markets. But this new paradigm really does not in any way take away from those co-benefits. And I think this visual, which has sort of been making the rounds, is a great reminder that what they call the sustainability transition, the climate transition, will require us to really think about these in a holistic way and avoid what they call carbon. And if we look at the next slide, we can see our fifth and final takeaway, major takeaway, probably much more to dig into. But it's really emerged as a key recommendation and goal for the apparel industry to move out of silos in order to speed up the transition to regenerative. There is an equally vibrant field of research and study going on in the food and beverage sector of the agricultural industry around regenerative. Research, webinars, papers, all kinds of activity going on. And by bridging across sectors, the apparel industry has the opportunity not just to learn from, but really to influence these policy developments, financing models, and research initiatives that are taking place. And in the next slide, you can see a great sort of visual reminder of one particular reason why that's important. Many of the crop rotation systems that are recommended and are part of regenerative approaches include both food and fibers. So here you can see maize, beans, sesame, and cotton being grown together. And in our case study 1 from J. Crew and Madewell and 5-lot cotton, there's profiling a rotation that includes sorghum, sunflowers, peanuts, and cotton. So you can see right away, we'll need cross-sector marketing, cross-sector technical assistance, extension agents who understand both food and fiber, and a lot of reasons why we really would accelerate this transition by working across sectors in this manner. So the next slide is just a thumbnail recap for you to have in the deck of these 5 key takeaways. I'll just give you a quick look at some of the central tools from the report now, and then Beth and I will share a bit about our specific recommendations for brands. So this slide shows you kind of our central, what we call the engagement pathway that we developed to try to help companies, again, break this landscape down into manageable chunks. And this was really inspired by the work that our sponsors are doing and many other companies who are putting pilot projects on the ground right now. So we tried to lay out a series of steps and take the landscape of partners and move it into those categories so that each company could consider in turn the partners that might be right for you based on geography, based on crop. We looked at the landscape of project developers and technical service providers. We used our matrix of regenerative programs to map the landscape of standards and certifications, scientific agencies and labs, as well as the group of tools, farm level accounting tools that are being used to monitor regenerative impacts and really talk about those benefits. And very importantly, in the orange bar on the right, we also focused on the key need to implement a just and equitable financial model in any project right from the start, to ensure that we're sharing the risk of the transition to regenerative agriculture with growers. In the next slide, you can see our matrix of programs. This was, again, our effort to map this landscape against a common framework. Quite challenging with over 80 groups in the matrix, but again, just trying to give you some chunks of different types of programs that you can look at to evaluate your own needs. And in our next slide, we did also include this map just to highlight some of the regenerative pilot efforts that are already underway from sponsors, project developers, and other companies, to give you a sense of what is on the landscape and also where there are gaps in geographies and crops where we would all collectively benefit from, again, co-learning with farming communities. So that is a quick overview of the content that we have in the report, and much more detail for you, and we can certainly try to share more in the question and answer. Let's look at some of our specific recommendations, trying to make this really actionable for you. Some of these do overlap with the takeaways, so we'll just skim through a couple of these. Our first recommendation is, again, that urging apparel companies and textile companies to approach regenerative agriculture as an investment in a fundamentally different system. So as Arif mentioned at the beginning, this is really a call to action for companies to invest in meaningful financial ways in projects that are developed in full partnership with farmers, with indigenous communities, forest stewards, ranchers, all of those who are really taking on the work of regenerative agriculture day to day. And that is in part because of the 8 short years that remain before 2030, encouraging us to really just get involved in developing the learning that we need without necessarily waiting for every guidance process, every decision, every element of the scientific process to be determined with certainty. Our second recommendation here, closely related, is ensuring that those who are the direct stewards of the land have an active decision-making role in any project from the start. And if you think about the co-benefits that I mentioned, we're really looking for farmers, growers, ranchers to be the ones to implement and to maintain those benefits over the long term. It's not abstract, it is their daily labor and their daily efforts that make this possible and these climate benefits possible for all of us. So for that reason, we need to be hearing from the very start about what is feasible and possible for them, what is needed to implement and maintain that. And this next photo and the next slide, to thank and acknowledge Oshadi, one of our case studies, for sharing these beautiful photos taken by Ashish Chandra that you see throughout the report. I'll pass it over to Beth for our next few recommendations, the brand perspective.
Sure, thanks. So the next recommendation we have is really to, for brands in particular, to look into your existing supply networks and identify areas of opportunity, whether that's with, with your existing producer partners or with new producer partners. And so this may seem sort of obvious, but it's really more of a, we often think about how do we scale these practices, how do we learn more about these practices? And that's certainly a big piece of it, but it's also just really fundamentally about how do we think differently about sourcing models in the industry, and really push for those direct connections to tier 4 producers. And for many larger brands, no, it may not be realistic to get to know every single one of your tier 4 producers, but can you go through, a farm group model to really have that type of on the ground relationship with those folks? Can you build longer term contracts with those farmers and growers to really help de-risk it for them? Those types of ways of thinking are really again, looking at how do you build these stronger relationships across that value chain is a huge takeaway that we would like to leave the industry with. And then also, on this kind of same front on bolstering knowledge in the industry, I guess we've really critically identified the role of scientific and technical partners in this space in really providing that expertise into brands. So, and when we say examine your staffing structures here, it can be, obviously either in-house or contracted, but really recognizing the importance of these sorts of technical service providers to help guide regenerative agriculture projects, ground them, in the soil science that's quickly evolving, making sure that practices are really rooted in what's happening on the ground. I think these types of roles we've identified, again, as just being really critical to the success of programs and really to the thoughtful expansion, I would say, of this concept across the industry and, across different landscapes. Let's see. And another great photo from Ashadi to sort of illustrate some of these, what we're trying to achieve here. Okay. Sarah, did you want me to do this one as well?
Sure, go ahead, jump in, or
Okay.
I can jump in after too.
Okay,
So go ahead.
yeah. So I'll start with this one. So fifth recommendation is really about leveraging existing certifications and standards. And this is something we really heard strongly from all of our over 30 interviewees that we looked at and that we engaged with for this report. Not needing to sort of create new programs or standards, but how do we leverage what's already out there and already on this regenerative path, so to speak, to help guide the industry. And again, respecting the rigor of those existing standards while also assessing these interdependent outcomes, as we've mentioned earlier. So, Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that was just another recommendation that we wanted to draw out for everyone.
No, that's great, Beth. Yeah, I just would add that we have, tried again to show what's out there on the landscape. And we've got a detailed sidebar in the report on the relationship between regenerative and organic, as well as a model for this kind of add-on concept that comes from the Forest Stewardship Councils. So hopefully giving you just more to dig into, think about this question about standards and certifications in the regenerative field.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to tie it back to Textile Exchange briefly, this is where our work on what we're calling the unified standard comes in. So the next evolution of our standards and how do we link those practices to outcomes. So follow up after if you'd like more information on that. Okay, back to you, Sarah.
Great, thanks, Beth. So number 6 in our recommendations is, again, to really focus on the implementation of a just, equitable, long-term financing mechanism right up front in the project. This is part of our understanding that we've asked growers to bear a huge part of the risk in our current agricultural system and the ways that can be extractive, and that the transition to regenerative agriculture can't be another piece that we're asking them to front the costs on alone. We cover a wide range of creative financing approaches in the report, including maybe somewhat more familiar pathways like using the marketing, operations, and CSR budgets, working with a company's charitable arm or foundation for financing approaches, using programs like the Impact program that Textile Exchange has been a part of developing, and then also using broader creative uses of this idea of integrated capital, drawing on a framework developed by the group RSF Social Finance that includes things like loans, loan guarantees, certain investments, and using these kinds of capital in combination to really support these programs. And we tried to give you some very specific information with a detailed chart of models, both from the apparel industry and from the broader agricultural field as well. If you can go to the next slide, Beth, I think this quote really sums it up for me from the New Economics Foundation Institute. We came to the place where we are right now in part because of our financial system and the goals and what's valued in financing right now. And we won't make that fundamental shift that we're calling for unless we address this underlying set of mechanisms as well. And last, but definitely not least, mentioned this already, so just briefly, this goal of increasing information sharing and cross-pollination with the food and beverage sector as a way to accelerate the transition overall. And I know that's a place where Textile Exchange will be providing leadership going forward, as you'll hear more about from Beth in a second. I'll close on the next slide with just this other, oh, I'm sorry, the one behind. This image with the ladybug that was just up is just reminding us that ecological systems don't distinguish between food and fiber. So again, remembering that need to work across sectors. And then I do want to specifically encourage you to please take a look at the detailed case studies that we have in the report. Number one from the J. Crew and Madewell J. Crew Group and 5 Lot Cotton on cotton with Texas farmers. Number two from VF Corporation and Terra Genesis on regenerative rubber production in Thailand. Number three from Oshadi in India on their regenerative cotton farm and system. And the fourth and final from Shaniko Wool Company in Oregon on their really pioneering approach to regenerative production on their wool ranches in their efforts to measure and model the benefits that they're seeing in their soils. So yeah, please, they've generously shared information about their supply chains, their challenges, their financing models, and a lot to learn from there. So we'll close our content overview here with this quote. It's also the closing quote in the report. I want to thank Forum for the Future and their Growing Our Future project as the source of this, and just really circling us back both to the idea that this is a very fundamental transformation, not just substituting in certain practices, but really looking at the structures as a whole. And that in turn brings us right back to the Indigenous roots and the Indigenous wisdom that we focused on. These are the kinds of approaches and conclusions that these communities and these experts have emphasized for generations, even millennia. So give it back to Beth for,
Yeah, love that quote.
Going forward.
And yeah, just a quick overview of kind of what's next for Textile Exchange and how we're really using this report as a jumping off point to convene the industry around some different action-oriented work streams. So a few opportunities. So we will be putting together what we call our community of practice on regenerative agriculture in 2022. And this is really just a way to kind of bring together a lot of the different work streams that are either already in progress for Textile Exchange with the industry or are, things that we wanted to, to implement as a jumping off point to this report. So the first one of these is what we're calling our Regenerative Agriculture Action Cohort. And that's really going to be a space where, and this is a new program for Textile Exchange. So a space where companies can come and not only understand kind of what's happening on the ground. So really using, again, our matrix of programs was really just the first phase of this effort to really catalog what's happening on the ground, help make those connections to the programs that make sense for you. Again, we as Textile Exchange don't provide sort of value judgments on programs, and we did not do that in the matrix, specifically because we're just here to try to provide understanding of what's happening on the ground, and different programs are going to make more sense for different partners and different organizations, and that's great. So anyway, more to come on this. But we really do want to provide some sort of channels for actually being able to pool resources around some of those broader structural actions that will be needed to really support the thoughtful building and scaling of this movement. The second piece is really just phase 2 research. So if you're interested in funding some additional research coming out of this report, we have a lot of ideas on this already of what could be useful to the industry. So please follow up with us afterward. We'd love to hear more ideas of where we should head next in terms of additional research that would be helpful for the industry on this topic. And then we, of course, have our roundtables. And within a lot of our roundtables, we've already been having many really robust discussions about regenerative agriculture. For many of you who are maybe already involved in our roundtables, I think you've heard this come through quite strongly. We're going to use this sort of community of practice model as a way to really feed in a more sort of harmonized way the work of the roundtables and make that sort of a back and forth between the additional research that we're doing and the action cohort. So it's all really sort of more connected, I guess I would say, because there's, of course, a lot of this is really issues that we're looking at across, whether it's, grazing systems or cropping systems, we're looking at a lot of these topics across, all systems and geographies. And then of course, there are many specific topics to different systems and geographies. So that's what we'll be looking at doing within the roundtables. And again, keeping that connected to the broader work. So be in touch with us. We have both Sarah's email and my email here below. Feel free to reach out to us both if you have any questions about the next steps, and more to come on this through the Textile Exchange Hub. You'll be seeing more information, and on the roundtable sites on the Hub as well. You'll be seeing more information about these opportunities and next steps. So a plug to join Textile Exchange if you're not already a member as well, so you can get access to all of that. And this will be our Q&A section. Sarah, I guess I'll turn it back to you here to sort of lead this portion.
Great, Beth. Thanks so much. And yeah, pleased to say we're doing well on our time. And so we're going to ask our sponsors to kick us off with our Q&A, just have a question that we're curious to ask each of them. And then are seeing some great questions come in the Q&A box. So please keep those coming, and we'll do our best to address as many of those as we can. I wondered if I could hear you. Are you okay on sound and connectivity?
You just cut out a second, Sarah. Did you say?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Katrina?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, Katrina, I'd love to ask you a question to kick us off in our Q&A. Are you okay on your connectivity?
I am.
Okay,
Yes, I'm
fantastic.
here. Great.
Well, the approach that Caring and Conservation International are taking with the Regenerative Fund for Nature was definitely a real influence on the report's engagement pathway. And now that you have the first 7 projects funded, I wondered if you could just share a few updates or early lessons learned from some of those projects that you have operating around now.
Absolutely, I'd be very happy to. Just by way of very quick background, with Conservation International at Caring, we launched a Regenerative Agriculture Fund about 1 year ago. And we, as you said, we have given grants out now to 7 different projects. So Argentina, Mongolia, South Africa, India, Spain, and France. And I think 2 things to say in terms of lessons so far. The first one, and I think this is the next step for our industry, is to really align on what it means to call a hectare, undergoing regeneration or regenerated. And the reason for that is I think that, with this report, I think we have a terrific framework to really, use very clear language around what regenerative agriculture is. And so the next step is to say, okay, this is now a hectare that we can consider to be under regeneration or regenerated. And the reason that's so important is to make sure that, that we don't end up in a situation where we're diluting down, we're taking away from the value of this initiative as an industry. So number 1 is really around measurement and clear KPIs and so on. The second thing is really it's an opportunity that I'd like to underline. I think all the brands that are on the call right now will relate to this. We're all making big commitments around sustainable materials and sourcing. And what we're all hearing from procurement teams across the industry is that there's just not enough. If we're talking about organic cotton or leather that's from a regenerative system, there's just not enough supply to meet the demand. And that will only worsen as we go forward unless brands get behind regenerative agriculture and start investing in these projects on the ground. So the other big lesson for us, and this is something we're actively engaging in, is how can we bring other fashion brands, but also food companies, beverage companies, fragrance companies to this work and look at landscapes together. And I think you did a really beautiful job outlining how these farm systems, these rangelands produce multiple crops. And so if we can co-fund the work of farmers in a pre-competitive way, it's a huge win for everyone. So I think those are the 2 big things: measurement and investment. Back over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Katrina. Really appreciate those insights. And yeah, thanks. I'm glad this resonates with what you're finding. And hopefully we can back up what you said with quite a section in one of our appendices on measurement. And as I mentioned earlier, the financial section that provides a lot of specific tools and models from different sectors. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. Arif, I wondered if I could ask you, as an agronomist, you're working with producers each day, and you wrote a recent blog post about some of the factors that help growers overcome the risks of transitioning to regenerative practices. Could you just share a little more with us about some of the factors that are making a difference for these growers that you work with each day?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Allow me to start with a quote. Actually, we believe in cotton. In cotton community believes that if smallholder farmers are empowered to use regenerative farming practices, they can replenish the land for current and future generations, boosting yield while building resilience to climate change. This way, farmers and the families will thrive, and so will our planet. So this is a core that we believe in while working with smallholders within Cotton Connect. Starting with, when talking about smallholders, I can give you the example from Pakistan that these smallholders are very resource poor farmers. They lack knowledge, and which actually leads to the indiscriminate, utilization of agrochemicals, which they procure from the ironic part is that they procure all these inputs from dealers, from the middlemen on credit basis, and which they have to return on high interest rate to this dealer. Thus, they are left with no income benefit from cotton cultivation at the end of the day. So they are not able to, send their children to schools. They are not able to have a good medical facilities available to them. On top of it, that because of these practices, that we are losing biodiversity in a very alarming rate. In Pakistan, if you ask me about Pakistan, we have lost almost 7 species of honeybees in Pakistan. Similarly, many bird species they have been eliminated because of it. So here comes the regenerative, I think. So we believe that, and based on our experience working with the farmers, that we believe that because of this regenerative and improved intervention in the area of the soil health, the biodiversity, the agroforestry, lead to a tangible improvement of livelihoods, meaning higher climate resilience and better income for the farmer. These effects are crucial incentive to enable farmers to promote nature-friendly cotton production practices. We also believe that, and we believe that improved regenerative practices combined with social fairness have a strong effect on agroecology and agrobiodiversity and lead to an improved functional biodiversity at and around cotton farms. We can also make small farmers agent of change if we enable them through training and remunerate them properly for their effort to protect nature. So this is we are talking about our experience. So similarly, if we train women farmers to grow tree seedling, we will enable them to generate additional income for their families, and at the same time, we could train them to become important biodiversity and climate ambassador. So this is all doable. Smallholder farmers, I think, I think that the group which need our attention, we need the the attention from the brands actually, from where they're sourcing all these raw material. So if we should not take any action right now, I think this is high time to take action. Otherwise, these smallholder will be an extinct species within a couple of next year. So I think the next 8 or 10 years are very crucial for all of us to implement what we have recommended in this report. Actually, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Arif. Thanks for that again, the call to action. I really appreciate you mentioning that, and I also appreciate you mentioning gender as an important piece of this landscape. It's something that we didn't make as very central here, but absolutely is part of the kind of intersectional approach and the social justice approach that we are calling for as part of regenerative thinking. So thank you for mentioning that. And Liz, wondered again, a similar question, I guess. We were just really excited to be able to feature the case study from J. Crew Group and 5-Lot Cotton as our case study number 1 in the report with Texas cotton growers. And just wondered if you would be able to share a few of the approaches that have been the most important in shaping this project, lessons that you're finding as you move into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. It's definitely been a journey. I think that some of the lessons that we have learned, we went in with a very specific, like, it must be XYZ, we want this certification, we want it to be this, have this outcome. And we realized pretty quickly that it is not a one size fits all program. And depending on the country and the farm and the grower, you're going to have to really be flexible and kind of approach it in the way that works. I think that there's been a lot of questions I've seen about organic and all, the differences and the challenges. And I think we really learned that we have to take a kind of a blended approach, right? Our ROC is an amazing certification. We love it and we're supporting it where we can, but not every grower can meet that. And that's not necessarily because they don't want to, it's just because of the way that they're set up. And so what we learned was we have to actually have kind of like a really blended approach to it and really focus on biodiversity, soil health, and what's going to get us there as fast as possible, versus trying to really push for something that maybe is the gold star, but maybe some of these growers just aren't ready for that yet, or in certain regions, it's just not possible. So I think that was our biggest learning going in. It's just being flexible and knowing that, if we can get growers on board here to make this transition into regenerative and sustainable farming practices, if it's not the gold standard quite yet, if they're getting there, we know that they'll see the benefits of it. And then potentially there's opportunity to kind of, get to that next level eventually. So for us, it was really about like the progress, the progression, how we can actually make progress without kind of waiting to try to get everything perfect, if that makes sense, right? So that was like our biggest learning, to be honest with you. And, we've been so happy with the report and the work that, was done, because it was also just really helpful to us to kind of formulate how we were going to approach it.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate that emphasis on flexibility and learning as we go, co-learning. And I think if you think about it, we've been working on developing our current agricultural system since maybe World War II, and that's 50 years of emphasizing certain things, emphasizing yield and certain practices. And so it's not going to be overnight that we are able to just quickly go back. So appreciate how you outlined that. So I think we can move into some Q&A from the audience. We have a lot of great questions.
So many
coming in
questions.
here. Yeah. Do you
We'll
want to
not
kick
have
us
time
off?
to get to them all,
No.
but we'll do our best to cover off on some of the highlights, I think. One that came in that I can start with, because I think it's quite easy to answer. I would totally agree. It's from Karen Wynn. Seems to me that regenerative ag has been embraced by so many because it is not clearly defined. Once it is better and more narrowly defined, potentially, I fear that a shiny new word will emerge. How do we make sure that a critical mass, especially food and beverage, has been brought into this framework? And first of all, I think we would totally agree, like, let's not fall into the trap of perhaps what's happened a bit in the past to try to boil something down into one shiny word, right? Like this is definitely, hopefully that's come through quite clearly here, and just with Liz's comments there as well, speaking from direct experience, being able to take a bit more of a nuanced approach and yes, have a good understanding of the framework of where we want to head, but it really is a continuum of practice, and we're going to need all steps along that continuum and sort of tailored to the specific situation, production system, the specific geography, et cetera, that we're working in to make that happen. And I think, we've had several questions here about, practically speaking, how can we more directly work with the food and beverage sector? And I think that's exactly what we're exploring now with some partnerships that we have with different organizations, and really trying to link into that sector a bit more and think through what some of those opportunities might be. And so more to come on this. I don't have a specific answer or a specific program for you right now for Textile Exchange, but Sarah, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that.
I think that's a great answer, Beth. I think we, again, heard from our interviews and research that we're just going to have to acknowledge and work with the place-based and context-based elements of regenerative, and that's going to some degree resist or require us to just shift our thinking a little bit from the push to sort of one definition or being reductionist, pinning things down. And it comes back to really working with growers and land stewards to understand what they're working with on a daily basis.
Yeah. Yeah. And that requires a mindset shift, right? Like I think in the industry, we've been quite conditioned to try to boil things down in that way, so to speak. And this is part of the sort of system change or system shift that we need to perpetuate in the industry. Another very quick one is just a quick question about is Textile Exchange working with the Fashion Pact on some of the on the ground work that they're looking to do? And the answer is yes, absolutely. We have a very close partnership with them and are supporting their efforts and vice versa. So reach out afterward, Diana, if you want more details on that. A number of questions have come in regarding the potential differences between organic and regenerative. Big questions. I would, first of all, of course, direct you to this section in the report because we were very thoughtful about crafting that section and really drawing in expert opinions there and making sure that we put a good deal of thought into that language. But what I would say at a high level, and Sarah, I'll let you jump in as well, is just that really the question is whether you're thinking about organic as a movement or an organic standard, I think is where there can be some sort of confusion or shifting. I mean, I think as we look at organic as a movement, it's in many ways very similar to what we're looking at with regenerative as a movement. However, particularly in the US, organic, of course, has been looked at as a specific standard or checklist of practices and in other areas as well. And so that's where then it becomes quite difficult to specifically compare practice against practice, right? Because again, in a regenerative approach, we don't want to prescribe a specific checklist of practices. It really is place and context specific. But really just thinking about, I think the top line comment is that these two movements are really in many ways trying to get at the same thing. I mean, they're trying to, empower better practices that will be, good for the land, that are rooted in community, like all of these things that, have been part of the organic movement for 20 years, 20 plus years, probably more, I think for some of you. I think it's not that far off from what we talk about when we talk about regenerative. So I think a couple of takeaways from that is let's not try to pit the two against each other. Basically, we're all part of the same path and trying to go down a path of being more in tune with the land and with nature. And yeah, I mean, I think that's what we would leave you all with on that. But again, reference that section. I would say definitely reference that section, and hopefully that will help provide some clarity on that. Sarah, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Just in the interest of time, I think that's amazing, Beth. Yeah, I want to just thank and acknowledge Sarah Compson from the Textile Exchange team and also on the iPhone World Board for really key contributions here and really thoughtful approach that she brought into that section. So I think you summed it up.
Yeah,
perfectly.
yeah. And the key there too is it's not black or white, right? We're on a continuum. So for example, something like a practice like no-till or, that may not be possible to do right away for a specific farming system, or there may be a case where minimal till always needs to occur. But how do you go down that path where you're being thoughtful about, we collectively are being thoughtful about how to grow these crops and raise these animals in harmony with nature, and moving away from things like synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and moving away from some of these more extractive practices. So, but again, it's not a black or white. It's not a switch that's going to flip. It's not a box to check. It's how do we get everyone moving in this direction? Yeah. Let's see.
We're just on to our last couple of minutes, Beth, and there's so much I wish we could answer here, but I can see that you're getting a lot of questions and interest about the cohort. So maybe you want to just use 1 minute to give a quick word on that before we have to wrap up, and we can try to answer some of these
yes,
by
absolutely.
answering directly to the askers.
Yeah, I mean, and again, just to provide a bit more context on that, we really serve one of our value drivers at Textile Exchange is convening. So we really want to, and you see that here, we really wanted to provide this sort of overview of the landscape analysis report, to help ground the industry in, what's already happening. What do we know? What do we not know? And, an extension of that will be, how do we convene the industry to take action and sort of structural action, not necessarily, helping convene the industry on, direct, like Textile Exchange is not going to be executing direct on the ground projects. However, we're thinking about how do we convene the industry around some of those structural needs or help accelerate the on the ground projects that are already happening. So more to come on this and kind of more details around this, but we really want to help the industry accelerate on this in a way that no one company can do on their own. So again, look to the hub and look to our communications channels for more information about how to, what the opportunities might be to participate in this in the future. We're still kind of working out the specifics of that. And the research as well. So again, let us know if you have any, burning ideas or thoughts for additional research to build on this report. But I think we're at time. So just want to thank everyone for your attention, for all the great questions, and we'll be continuing this discussion again on the hub and in our roundtables and in our other communications channels.
Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. As a friendly reminder, as Beth stated, and we will be sharing more on the hub. And please look in the chat for a link to continue this conversation there as well. Also, as a friendly reminder, an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.